What it do, YouTube? It's Wukan reacts, you know what I'm saying? And we finna be reacting to why 2021 will be a horrible year by infographic show. No, gotta learn a little bit. And 2020 hasn't been the best year, but let's hope 2020, heading into 2021, hopefully it's better. Straight into it. 3, 2, 1.
We're sure a few of you have thought at some point this year, I can't wait for 2021. 2020 wasn't exactly a barrel of laughs for most people. We won't even go into biblical fires, floods, famine, and swarms of hungry locusts. COVID-19 was a good enough reason to get most people to admit that 2020 wasn't their favorite year to date. You don't have to get the virus to hate the damn thing. Maybe it robbed you of work. Maybe it drove you half crazy trying to fully understand it. Maybe it made you anxious and depressed as it did for millions of others. Maybe after lockdown you looked at your protruding belly and almost thought you were pregnant. Let's face it, we can all take something negative from the pandemic. The question is, can things get any worse? Could 2021 be a kind of horror sequel to 2020? Do you remember that tagline from the movie Jaws? Just when you thought it was safe to go back in the water. Let's imagine the movies. 2020, the year of the pandemic, and the sequel, 2021, the beginning of the end. Maybe you're now thinking, no way, no damn way will next year be worse than this. Things couldn't get any worse. Well, we're sorry to inform you, but things could always get worse. Now you need to hear how things could really go down the pan in 21. It goes without saying that if no COVID-19 vaccine was released and available to the public at large next year, then deaths could continue to spiral and lockdowns could carry on, destroying economies and wrecking families. As we write this, there's news about a vaccine, and it is positive news. Preliminary trials suggest it works, but it's early days. And also as we write this, there has been a huge spike in COVID daily deaths. What if the virus mutates into something worse? Is that even possible? According to Nature magazine, one of the better science resources out there, the virus has been mutating. We tell you exactly what a well-known virologist said about that, but for 99% of you, it would sound like scientific gobbledygook. In simple terms, yes, the virus has mutated. The good news is scientists came out and said the media exaggerated that. You can go online and see the numerous news stories with headlines saying things like, mutation more contagious and mutation more deadly. That might not be true at the moment, but the fact is, this virus could get worse next year. It's unlikely, but it definitely could happen. In November, a group of scientists was asked to predict what the state of the pandemic would be in 21, and you guessed it, they had no idea. One scientist at Yale said the Pfizer vaccine looks promising, but he also said even if the vaccine passes more trials with flying colors, it'll take many months to get people vaccinated. COVID will not magically disappear. Well, it likely won't. Viruses have been known to peter out in the past, but we might have another year on our hands. Another scientist said it won't be enough just vaccinating certain groups of people, i.e. those most vulnerable. In other words, we aren't going to solve the COVID problem just because we most likely have a vaccine that will stop COVID and extracts for 80% of those that are given it. More virus casualties are only a possibility, but what's almost certain is the chaos that will happen next year because of global lockdowns. The fallout from lockdowns is very real. Some astute investors, COVID-19 contractors, tech folks, and vaccine makers might be getting incredibly rich as the sun shines down on empty streets, but the vast majority of folks have been hit hard by the pandemic. It might be bad now,
Did the vaccine and it works
year?
and can
It's hard to
put
say
the
just
thing
how
back
many
to
people have
normal?
lost their jobs due to
You
lockdowns. As we
gotta
write
put it
this,
for
The
free
Guardian
then.
says
You can't charge people.
670,000 jobs have been lost in the UK since the start of the year. Spain, a country that is very
That's just
reliant
not
on
fair.
tourism for its economy, is said to be the hardest hit
Many
country
homeless
in
people
Europe. In Thailand,
don't
it's
even have a
reported that
chance.
a
They just have
million
to live
people
on the
working
street.
in the tourism industry lost
And
their jobs this
dirty,
year,
and
and
you
they
could
had no help
easily
or
get it
hardly
there.
any help
You
from the
have to make it
government.
free.
OECD
Not only are you
statistics show a
screwing the
massive
rich
economic
people, but you're
decline
also
in many
screwing the poor.
countries. The Pew Research Center
poor
said in
people have it.
September 1 in 4
Mm.
U.S. adults had trouble
I guess
paying their
it's the
bills since
vaccine,
the
though.
outbreak.
The rich
It
people
also
can't
reported
get it, but
25% of people said that
it's just not
someone
right.
in their house had
They gotta
lost
make
their
it for
job.
everybody if they do.
50% of them found another job, but the other half is still unemployed. Okay, so these statistics are going to change a lot, but one thing is for sure, there will be no more magic wands available. Millions and millions of people around the world are going to face hardship and debt next year. COVID poverty is very real. We might see how these hardships manifest next year. We already know that in the US, suicide hotlines have been busier than ever this year. Worried about the effect stress has on the body? Yep, it negatively affects the efficacy of the immune system. That might translate into more health problems next year. In the US, there's already a drug addiction problem that is frankly out of control. The The question is, with all this job loss, stress, and depression, do you think 2021 will see positive results regarding addiction? Listen to this excerpt from a research paper that was published in July. According to a recent study from the Wellbeing Trust, the high levels of stress, isolation, and unemployment due to the COVID-19 pandemic could cause up to 75,000 deaths of despair related to drug, alcohol, and suicide. What a bleak-sounding phrase, deaths of despair. That 75,000, by the way, only relates to the USA, a country with some social safety nets. As for suicides, we're not going to bother citing all the news media and studies. Look for yourself. Thoughts of suicide and actual suicide have increased in many countries. So, if you were the kind of person to gamble, how much money would you put on 2021 being a bumper year for addiction, suicide, ill health, and mental illness? What about crime rates? We already know this year the murder rate went through the roof in some big cities in the US, but do you think this will be a trend in 2021? What about domestic violence? What happens when you upset the flow of drugs and gangs and they struggle to get their cut? It's too early to say just how crime rates will be affected by lockdowns, but so far, the outlook isn't good. COVID has created a perfect storm, and we don't think anyone will disagree. The question is, how bad will the storm be? Maybe it'll fade away and not be half as bad as some people think, or maybe it'll be far worse, a real home wrecker. 2021 could be the year that crime goes through the roof. Maybe some people already know this in the US because gun purchases drastically increased this year. Okay, so far we have mass job loss. As a result of this, we have stress, we also have depression and debt. We might see some more drug and alcohol use, and we might see surges in crime. Is that it? The end of the show? No, we're not even close to finishing. Things could get a lot worse. Imagine this scene. It's July 2021 and you just gone out to Walmart to pick up that gift for your aunt's birthday. You walk through the doors and before you can get that far, a robot that looks like a mini version of those Doctor Who Daleks approaches you. It doesn't say exterminate, but it says do not enter. Go straight back home. You are currently in violation of Clause 6.0606 of the Enhanced Freedom to Not Do Much law. Do not ignore this demand. Oh, and you have an outstanding parking fine. And we also know about that sketchy website you visited at 2:38 p.m. last week. We're just kidding, of course, but privacy advocates around the world are right now very concerned about new surveillance technology and how it'll be used or perhaps abused. We already have facial recognition cameras that can tell if you have a high temperature. We already have drones and robots that move around public spaces and tell you what to do. These things might help in time of crisis, but is there a chance that this technology will create a kind of dystopia that we've been seeing in sci-fi movies for a while now? Some of the biggest human rights organizations this year came out and said they were worried governments might use the pandemic as an excuse to curtail our freedom. When governments enforce restrictions on our freedom, they usually stay. And 2020 is just a warm-up for 2021. If the virus doesn't go away, perhaps in 21 we'll be tracked and traced to the extent that we start to feel our freedoms have diminished. Will next year usher in police states around the world? We've already seen how governments spy on us without telling us, but could things get a lot worse? As the American Civil Liberties Union wrote, maybe after they've watched you outside and in your home and on the web, you'll become suspicious for the vaguest of reasons. This is what was said in a letter that was signed by more than 300 leading academics this year. We are concerned that some solutions to the crisis may, via mission creep, result in systems which would allow unprecedented surveillance of society at large. China is already a surveillance state that's criticized in the West, but don't be surprised if in 2021 Western countries adopt the China monitoring model. Welcome to the new normal, aka 1984, a true story by George Orwell. And for our viewers in China, well, we know you can only watch our show via proxy since YouTube is banned there, but just know that you're in our thoughts.
I didn't know that.
And what about that necessity we call food? During the height of the pandemic, the New York Times reported that food banks across the U.S. couldn't meet the demand of the hungry. Demand for food assistance is rising at an extraordinary rate, said the newspaper. Will this suddenly go away in 2021? We doubt that. You can go online and read about food queues stretching for miles, and that's not only in the U.S. The Guardian reported in November that there was an emerging group of people in the U.K., what it called the newly hungry. These were mostly desperate middle-income families, not only poor families. So think about it. Economies probably won't go into hyperdrive in 21. Jobs won't all just come back since so many businesses have gone for good. Get ready for a new normal of food banks popping up all over the place next year. Experts also think homeless rates will rise next year. In the U.S., the Coalition for the Homeless said there will be a tsunami of evictions if people don't get help from the government to assist them to pay their rent. This help will have to be ongoing if it's to work. Right now in the U.S., there's an eviction moratorium to protect people, but that's only in place until December 31st. One expert predicts Mass evictions at the beginning of the new year. What an awful come down that would be after the celebrations. Let's also remember that while a lot of our viewers come from the US, millions of people who watch our shows come from countries that have very threadbare safety nets for people in place who've hit a financial rock bottom. What if people don't get the help they need? If you walk down some streets in LA or city centers in UK cities, you'd think these two countries belong to the developing world or worse, post-apocalyptic nations. The homeless problem is insane and it could get much worse next year. The Washington Post wrote in September that hundreds of millions of people were on the brink of starvation because of the pandemic. Oxfam wrote that the world should be prepared for a hunger pandemic. Other organizations are warring off mass starvation in poorer nations that are already suffering from endless conflicts and agricultural chaos. The World Bank estimated in 2020 that by 2021 there will be 150 million more people living in extreme poverty. Maybe you think this won't affect you, but when the chaos flaps its wings on one side of the world, it usually has a way of affecting the other side of the world. This is happening now, but what if millions of people do start to face starvation? What can be the upshot of that besides dying or ill health? Well, one thing that might happen is people start looking for a populist despot to get them out of the fix. More conflicts could break out, more war, more desperation. If history has taught us anything, it's that that's always a recipe for disaster. If wealthier nations start seeing more people without enough to eat, what might be the consequence of that? More desperate voters rallying behind the banner of a despot. More honest people turn to a life of crime. People will do anything to survive. Not enough food in 2020 could mean devastation in 2021. America's infamous prison industrial complex is probably getting ready for a big expansion. Could it get any worse than that? Yes, of course it could. Right now, we're seeing a very divided country in terms of politics. Conservatives are constantly arguing with liberals, and it seems no side will back down. The haves don't seem to care much about the have-nots. The latter is asking, who's got my back? The former cares less about poverty than it does about who said what on Twitter. Just look online and check out Protests 2020. It's been a big year for disagreements. This could of course lead to progressive change and we all might live happily ever after, maybe in the long run anyway. But what if all this division leads to larger protests that turn to violence that manifests as a civil war? Something has got to give. There has to be a middle ground or 2021 could be a very ugly year. Let's not forget that people genuinely fight for causes, but when you throw in mass unemployment and hunger, sometimes anger comes ahead of reason. Maybe you'll be lucky enough to have cash in 2021, but that doesn't mean you won't suffer. Travel research showed that during lockdowns in 2020, people were gunning to get out of their country and travel. But what if that can't happen next year? What if borders don't open? What if the travel you have to navigate so much red tape it's just not worth the trouble? That'll mean another year in the same place watching the same disaster news, wondering when you'll ever be able to escape. Okay, so this is all very grim, but remember it's a worst case scenario show. Don't worry, soon we'll turn all this on its back and give you a best case scenario show. We hope we haven't depressed you.
And we'll be
remember,
there to
things could always be worse.
We'll be there to react to that too, dude.
Keeping Up with the Kardashians will have its final season in 2021. Now, you should see how we got many things right about 2020 and why
Yeah, so let's hope none of that happens. Just pray and wish for the best, you know? But it's very possible, you know? And hopefully we get back to normal. Without further ado, 100 subscribers, like and subscribe. Wukan reacts out. Peace.